Today is April 24th, 2017. My name is Martin Frank, and I'm here at McCormick Place Convention Center to interview a long-term member of the Society, Dr. Irving Zucker. Welcome, Irv.
Thanks.
It is my honor and pleasure to interview Irv. He is a former president of the Society and has been a member of APS since 1975. His research is focused on the neural control of the circulation in the heart, and he is currently the editor of the American Journal of Physiology, Heart and Circulatory Physiology. Irv, welcome to this interview of the Living History program. We look forward to learn a bit about your career and your experiences as a physiologist.
Thank you very much, Marty. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a great honor to be part of the Living History project.
Great. Can I, if it's okay with you, I'd like to ask you your first question.
Go right ahead.
All right. Can you tell us a bit about your upbringing in New York City and what it was like growing up, and indeed how you became interested in science?
Well, growing up in New York was a great experience. Now that I look back on it over many years, I really feel privileged to be being brought up in that environment. In those days, most people that lived in the area that I lived with in the Bronx were first or second generation immigrants, and families were very close-knit, hardworking people, and so I learned a lot living on the streets, so to speak. And we had a wonderful upbringing, and we stayed in the Bronx until I was about 23 years old when my parents moved to Queens. As they moved up, they moved to a slightly better neighborhood, and then my education was carried out from the Bronx through Queens, and moved forward with that.
Now, did you have siblings?
No, I had no siblings. I was an only child, so I got a lot of attention, obviously. And it was a good thing because my parents never made a lot of money. They were hardworking people. My father actually was an immigrant himself. Came from Poland in, I think it was 1920.
Okay.
And my mother was a first-generation American. And when they came here, they really didn't have very much. My father went into a business with his father, running a restaurant, and that was his career for the rest of his life. And my mother worked mostly secretarial work. She worked for an insurance company for most of her working life until she retired.
So how did you get interested in science?
Well, it's interesting. I was always been curious about how things worked. Okay. I seemed to excel in school in subjects that related to science. And importantly, everybody has some influence in their life. And my mother's brother, my uncle, was a physician. He was a hematologist oncologist. And in those days, it was hard to get to medical school, and it was hard to afford to pay for medical school. But he persevered, worked very hard, and he did a great job. And he was a great influence on me. Mm-hmm. And I had to make a decision whether or not I wanted to follow in his footsteps and be a physician, or go in a different pathway. Mm-hmm. And I got very involved in the biology club in high school. I went to DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, which that in those days was a all-boys high school, and okay. There was a lot of competition, as you can imagine. But I got very interested in biology. And I made a decision after seeing how hard my uncle worked and how personally he took his patients in terms of their therapy. I decided that it wasn't for me, okay. that I didn't have the personality to treat patients. And so I decided I was interested in trying to understand the mechanism of how things were put together, and I was always fascinated with the human body. And I emigrated to study biology in college, and of course went on to graduate school from there.
And you went and did your undergrad at the City University of New York, and what was it like there? It
Correct.
was clearly an amazing school when one considers people who've gone through there.
Yeah, you know, there were something like 8 or 9 Nobel laureates that graduated from City College.
So what happened to you?
Well, I guess I wasn't up to snuff.
Okay.
A lot of people don't know this, but I actually did my first year of undergraduate school at NYU in Manhattan. And I would commute every day from the Bronx to Manhattan. And NYU, as you know, is a private institution and quite expensive. And even though I worked all summers in the Catskill Mountains, making as much money as I could, we still couldn't afford it. And after this first year, I transferred to City College. And that was in Upper Manhattan, in part of Harlem. And I thought that was a really great experience, you know, on the footsteps of many of these great people that went there. And in those days, it was completely free if you were a city resident of New York. And so it gave me a tremendous opportunity. I'm not sure what would have happened if I hadn't had the experience of going to City College and graduating. It took an extra year, but it was well worth it.
What made you decide to go on for a master's degree and to go off to Missouri?
Yeah. Well, in those days, the path to a PhD usually included a master's degree. Okay. Today, it's not that common. But at that time, I think I was finishing up City College around 1965, and I started to survey the landscape to see where I could go to school and still get a little bit of money to support myself. And I wrote to several schools, and UMKC offered me a teaching assistantship. And I hate to tell you this, but it was only $2,400, but in those days it was a substantial amount of money, and I could live on it. And I lived in a dorm or in an apartment one year. And so I went out, I didn't even consider anything else. I just got in an old broken down car, I drove out to Kansas City, and I did a master's degree in biology.
But clearly, you can't take the boy out of New York City.
No.
And you ended up coming back to New York University to work on your PhD.
Yeah, actually, I came back to New York Medical College,
okay.
Which in those days was located on Fifth Avenue and 106th Street, and is affiliated with Flower and Fifth Avenue hospitals. Okay. And I worked with someone you know well, Gabe Cayley. I was his first graduate student. And his area of expertise was twofold. He was interested in the microcirculation and in the renin-angiotensin system. And he had done some work when he was a graduate student at NYU in pathology with Ben Zweifach on the renin-angiotensin system. So when I got to his laboratory, I decided to work on an area that he was interested in. In those days, there was a phenomenon called or the renal response to volume expansion. The sodium excretion that one saw in response to volume expansion was called third factor. Because nobody knew what it was, and it still occurred when you controlled for the other two factors were mineralocorticoid release and glomerular filtration rate. And he did some very sophisticated experiments with cross-perfusion of dogs, where you volume expanded one animal and saw a sodium excretion in the other animal. So when we were thinking about a thesis project, we thought, well, there must be a way that the body senses sodium that we're not aware of. And we hypothesized that there was a central sodium sensor, different from the classical osmoreceptor that Verney described in the 40s. And so we designed experiments to change central or CSF sodium concentration. And we saw major changes in sodium excretion. And then we went on to look at the influence of the renal nerves in that regard. And from that experience, I just became interested in volume regulation and renal physiology and how the body senses changes in volume. And that's how we got into cardiac receptors and the interplay between the nervous system and the cardiovascular system.
Okay. Having worked with Gabe for many years and being his first graduate student, it would be nice to share a little information about what Gabe was like as a mentor as well.
He was a very unique person. He came from Hungary in the 50s with nothing in his pocket. Again, a self-made person. He He had started medical school in Hungary right after World War II, and then he decided to come to the U.S. And he got a master's degree at Columbia University, and then a PhD at NYU, and then moved over to New York Medical College as an assistant professor. He had a great zest for life, and he enjoyed science immensely, and that rubbed off on everybody in the lab. He treated people very well, and he tried to show us the joy in doing science. He really was a sort of a Renaissance man in that regard. Mm-hmm. The joy of doing science and interplaying science with the rest of life. And I learned a lot from Gabe, and we remained very, very good friends for many years, and I really miss him.
Now, not only did he mentor you in your research, clearly he had an effect on you vis-a-vis the chairmanship of the department, because he was chair of physiology at New York Medical College for 30 years?
Yeah, it may have been more than 30 years. He was chair, and I did emulate a lot of what I do now from the way he ran the department. Everybody really liked him. He supported the people in the department. He would go to the dean and argue tooth and nail to support people in the department. And he was not very diplomatic. As a Hungarian, I mean, he said what he felt, and he didn't know how to strike a deal, so to speak, without putting his face into it. But he was very supportive of the department, and especially the students in the department. I was quite amazed as a young graduate student, a first-year graduate student, he sent me to the IUPS meeting in Munich, Germany in 1971.
Okay.
And I was really amazed that he wanted to do it. He thought it was a good experience, whether or not I had an abstract to present or not. And I, quite frankly, I do the same thing now, and I've had many graduate students, and some of them are here at this meeting, and they're not presenting abstracts, just to learn.
You got your doctorate in 1972 at New York Medical College under Gabe Cayley, and you found yourself going back out to the Midwest, yes, taking a position in Omaha in Nebraska, and you work with Joe Gilmore there.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about the postdoc.
So that's an interesting story because, as I told you, I was interested in volume regulation, and of course one reads the literature and sees who's doing work in this area. And Joe Gilmore had been working at the University of Virginia in Bob Burns' department on issues related to volume regulation and sodium excretion and renal function. And Joe, as you know, came from Stanley Sarnoff's lab at the NIH. And I contacted him at a nephrology meeting. And we met and we talked about what I wanted to do, and he said, you know, why don't you put together an NIH fellowship and we'll apply for it, and if you get it, you can come and work in the lab. So I did. I went home and I worked on it, and we got the fellowship. And then I got a call one day from Joe Gilmore and said, well, I have to tell you I'm leaving Virginia and moving to Nebraska. So I said, where? And he said, Omaha, Nebraska. I become the new chair of physiology at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. So I discussed this with my wife, and after a day of crying, she agreed to join me in Omaha. And the rest is so-called history. Joe was also a very good mentor. He had a very different personality than Gabe. He was very work-oriented. He had lots of publications, and he took very great pride in having experiments that you could be proud of. He always used to say that if you can't show an original recording in a paper, it's not worth anything. So I was very grateful for him, and he was very enthusiastic when we did experiments together. And in those days, we did experiments in anesthetized dogs, and he was the first one to run out into the hallway and grab the first person to show them the new data that he just collected. And so Joe really set the tone, and also was quite supportive of the department he put together there.
Now, you went out there as a postdoc, but somehow you ended up staying, and the promise you no doubt made to Judy that you would come back to New York was not kept.
No, it wasn't. As things happen, you get involved in research, and if things are going well, you don't want to break away from that. After a couple of years in Omaha, I did look for jobs, and I was offered a position at Loyola of Chicago in Walter Randall's department.
Okay.
And we discussed this, my wife and I discussed this at great length, and things were going so well in Omaha. In the lab, we were publishing, we were collecting data very quickly. I decided that it would be better to stay put. And I presented this to Joe Gilmore, and he offered me a position as an assistant professor in the department for $1,000 more than Walter Randall offered.
Oh, and probably could buy more in Omaha than in Chicago.
And it could buy more, yeah. So we decided to stay, and our children were born there, and the rest is so-called history.
Right.
Yeah.
So by 1989, you had risen to being the chair of the Department of Physiology.
Correct.
And clearly there have been good times and not so good times within the department. But what lessons can you share with people about leading an administrative structure like a department and coping with the ups and downs that we all face?
Yeah. So let me just say a few words about how I got to be chair, because that was an interesting process as well. Joe Gilmore decided at a quite early age to retire in 1987, and then there was a search that took about a year and a half, 2 years, an external search, and some of the people that interviewed were upstanding members of the American Physiological Society, and Dean and I threw my name in the hat. I thought that if I was going to stay in Omaha, if I was going to make the rest of my career there, I should have some control over what I would like to see the department morph into, and how I wanted to build a program and have a vision for moving forward. And I decided to take the chair after it was offered to me, and it took us a good 10 years from 1989 to about 1998 to put a faculty together that allowed us to do what we wanted to do in the field of neural control of the circulation. Now, the good thing about taking over a chair when another chair retires is oftentimes people leave. And when that happens, you have slots to fill, and that's an advantage for a new chair. Mm-hmm. However, there are definitely challenges, and it's much more difficult today than it was in 1989. The financial challenges are the biggest problem. Mm-hmm. Challenges with getting all faculty funded, and it's certainly not up to me, but we set the tone for that, and it's harder today because of the restricted federal funding. The state funding is also an issue, and so every year we juggle money, borrow money from Peter to pay Paul, and that part of it is not fun, but it's a necessary part of doing the job. I think what is fun is putting the department together, making a reputation for the department, for the institution, and for yourself. And that part has gone very well for many years.
Who was in the department when you took over, and who were some of the people you recruited to the department?
So many of the people that were in the department when I took over are now all retired. Frank Clark was an engineer who worked on proprioception and joint sense, and actually one of his claims to fame is a very famous paper on the Hering-Breuer reflex that he did with Kurt von Euler many years ago. Mike Mann, also a neurophysiologist that has subsequently retired. But we recruited people like Bill Joyner was in the department also, and he left, one of the people that left and went to East Tennessee State. But I was able to recruit some really good young people with the vision that one day we would have a critical mass to build a program project and other grants. So I recruited George Rosansky, who was then in cardiology. He was an electrophysiologist, and Kaushik Patel, who had trained at Iowa and was an assistant professor at the University of South Dakota at that time. And importantly, Harold Schultz, that worked with John and Hazel Coleridge at the CVRI in San Francisco, who had a lot of experience on sensory endings in the myocardium. And after a few years, we put together this program project together, and it's still going strong. So we're very proud of that. And then along the way, we picked up some other really good young people. Steve Sansom, who worked with Gerhard Giebisch and was at the University of Texas, came up to join us. Pam Carmines, as another part of the renal faculty, Babu Padanalam, who's still with us, and then with some good young people, Matt Zimmerman, who is in oxidative stress and neural control, who trained in Iowa with Robin Davison, and now we have some new recruits like Erica Bosin and Adam Case that we're very excited about and hope they'll do well.
You mentioned just a moment ago that the program project is still funded.
Yep.
Clearly, you have had an amazingly long history of funding. What do you ascribe the success to, and especially in light of the ups and downs of funding these days, and actually over the last 20 years?
Yeah, so the program project is now entering it, I think in September it'll be entering its 18th year. And we're very, very proud of that. But we've had a variety of grants along the way, mostly from American Heart and NIH. And what I think the success boils down to are people. I think it's the people. I think it's having the right people that are enthusiastic about what you're doing, with good ideas, to keep you in check, to make sure that what you're proposing is reasonable, that have the techniques and the technology and understanding of moving from point A to point B, and helping to write those grants and to get the data needed to those grants. And I've been really fortunate to have those kinds of people around me for my whole career. Mm-hmm. And part of it, I like to think, is because of the people I chose to have around me, and part of it is serendipity. Part of it is good postdocs and graduate students that have contributed an enormous amount. Mm-hmm. Nothing can be done by individuals anymore. So I think that's been the success. And as one makes a reputation in the field, I think, and publishing, of course, good papers, I think that helps in getting additional funding. Mm-hmm. And one thing about physiology and about science in general is that it's never boring. It's always dynamic, it's always changing. And if you're able to adapt with that change and you can do new things, then I think you'll be successful, because you have to invent things as you go along. You know, when the Empire State Building was built in 1929, they didn't have the center pivot cranes. Right. They had to invent ways of getting from one level to the next. So that's kind of an analogy. You do it on the job, and I think if I had to do the same thing every day over and over, I think I would have been long retired.
We talked a little bit about the people who influenced your career, Gabe Cayley, Joe Gilmore, and so we talked a little bit about your research directions. But as you reflect back now on a long career, what do you think were some of the more significant things that you have contributed to physiology and to science?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think we have done a lot of work in trying to understand the relationship between sensory endings in the vasculature, in the myocardium, and the regulation of neurohumeral balance. Mm-hmm. And at first we did this looking at just healthy animals and trying to understand processes. But now, lately, not lately, but over the last 15, 20 years, we have actually focused in on heart failure and hypertension and other disease states. And we were one of the early groups to show the role of central mediators in sympathetic regulation, which includes angiotensin receptors, oxidative stress, nitric oxide, and the interplay between the receptors for these molecules, how they regulate neuronal activity centrally, and what methods we could use to modify that in the chronic heart failure state. Over the last 5 or 6 years, we've become much more interested in mediators of oxidative stress in the central nervous system, the role of transcription factors like NRF2. As you know, I was trained as a plumber to understand hemodynamics, and and this is what I meant about it not getting boring, as time went on and biology changed and the questions changed and new techniques came to pass, I had to teach myself many of these things because I wasn't trained that way. And other people have taught me as well along the way. Mm-hmm. And I think our contributions to the literature, to understanding sensory regulation in the cardiovascular system has in part matured because of learning new things. Mm-hmm. And we look forward to even moving forward with other things. And I never thought I would be working with many lines of transgenic animals and trying to understand how we can use these animals as tools to understand processes. But now that's the way the laboratory is, and what the next big hurdle will be, I don't know.
One of the things we talk about when we consider academia is a three-legged stool of teaching, research, and service. In theory, that's what defines you as an individual, especially when you come up for tenure decisions, although research seems to be a predominant area these days. You have been an exemplary citizen when it comes to service. Currently, you're the editor of the American Journal of Physiology, Heart and Circulatory Physiology. You were the 81st president of the society. You have served on numerous committees for APS, and you've done the same for many other organizations and associations. What are your thoughts about the importance of service as one of the elements of career development and growth, and how that service helped contributed to the successes that you've had?
That's a great question. I think it's very important, and it's important to do it very early in one's career. One of the things that Gabe Cayley did for me is he made me a member of APS as a student, and that student membership translated into a regular membership. Mm-hmm. And as I started to go to the old FACID meetings, I became more and more involved with the inner workings of the society, and I identified very early with it. And it's been really my academic home for my whole career. One has a home in a university, but one has a home in the greater community, and I think you need a scientific home. And APS has really done a lot for me in that regard. And so when you affiliate with a society like that, where there are important educational programs, there are important other support programs for scientists, advocacy programs, things like that, you cannot not give back. Mm-hmm. So to speak. You have to work hard to see it perpetuate. And as my career moved on, I became involved in committee work and things that interested me. And it's sort of a natural progression as you go from one to the other. I think APS has done a great job, in large part to your efforts over, 30 years now, something like that? Something like that. And I think, more people in APS should understand the inner workings of how the society works. I mean, it took me a while to understand the committee structure and what happens behind the scenes to make meetings run, mm-hmm. To have educational programs and the hard and dedicated work of a fairly large staff. And AJP has always been, a major journal in many, many fields. And for me, my first paper, actually my second paper was in AJP. I hate to tell you this, my first paper was in Physiology.
Okay.
But my second paper, the work I did with Gabe Cayley on sodium excretion, my second and third papers were both in AJP, and since that time, many of my papers have been in AJP. And now that I'm editor, I see the importance of the journal even more, and we work really hard to make it as prominent as we can. I think the publications entity in APS has been an envy of a lot of societies, and one of the few remaining self-published kinds of publication publication programs, and I think that's very important. So what I would say to young people is get involved as early as possible. And what I would say to the mentors of those young people is get them involved in society work, of whatever the discipline is, as early as possible, because it'll pay off big dividends in the long run, I think.
One of the things that we all say is science has no borders. And your research and your stature is not just reflective here in the United States, but is reflected internationally. You're known around the world. And tell us a little bit about how that has played out, because you seem to be always going somewhere to present a talk.
I think that's been terrific. It's been an enormous fringe benefit, and I don't travel just because I want to travel. I travel to interact with scientists from every place, and part of my lab has been populated with scientists from all over the world for many years, and I really enjoy interacting it. And I think that one gets to see the different viewpoints that come out of environments in Germany or China or Italy or wherever it may be, South America, and that pays off great dividends in the future. Interactions, real scientific interactions come from that. Visiting scientists come to the lab, and then of course there are funding opportunities that come together from that. So I think that science is a global entity. You can look at science like sports. Okay. You know, when every time the Olympics comes around, right? Nobody cares about political issues. Nobody cares about ethnic issues. It's the sport, and the science is the same way. If I talk to a scientist from the Middle East or from Europe or from the no more Soviet Union or from Russia, we don't care about our politics. It makes no difference. It's about the science.
We're here in Chicago for the annual meeting of the American Physiological Society as part of the experimental biology meeting. But you mentioned going to your first FASB meeting. Tell us about that first experience, and where it was, and how it may differ from what we do now.
So that meeting must have been around 1969 or so, and it was in Atlantic City, where every FASB meeting was for many years, and I was presenting my first paper it was an abstract in a renal session, and in those days, Atlantic City had this long boardwalk, and we would run from hotel to hotel where the abstracts were presented. And the day I had to present my abstracts, it was pouring. It was raining like crazy. And I went to a session at one hotel, and I looked at my watch and I said, uh-oh, I better get to my session. And I ran in the pouring rain to this session, and I think I was the first speaker. And I got up there and I was dripping wet. And I was nervous as could be. It was my first talk. And I really can't remember who the chairs of the session were, but they were prominent people, I remember. And luckily things went fine, and I came away saying, gee, it wasn't as bad. Maybe I shouldn't have gotten so nervous. But the nervousness never goes away every time you give a talk. So that was my first experience. And as I mentioned, Gabe Cayley would send his students to, New York was only a 2-hour drive from Atlantic City, so it was very easy. And then when Atlantic City got gambling and FASB moved away and then morphed into EB, I can't remember the year when EB was first was presented.
93.
93, okay. And then, of course, now it's in many different venues every year. But that was my experience, and I have not been back to Atlantic City since it left.
Well, I think it has crumbled a bit because gambling didn't seem to succeed.
No, right.
Well
it was a different place.
They may even invite the scientists back one of these days. I would be remiss not to ask about the role Judy and your family has played in your career.
Well, They played an enormous role. I give my wife a lot of credit for coming out to Omaha with me in the first place. And then, as I said earlier, our children were all, I have 3 daughters. They were all brought up in Omaha, and now they're scattered around the country. But Judy has stuck with me all the time. She has been very supportive, and to tell you the truth, it would not have been much fun without her support. Obviously, we go to a lot of conferences together, and in those instances when we can take a little time after the science is done to enjoy whatever atmosphere we're in, we really have a great time. And she's been so the love of my life, and I thank her tremendously for that.
All right. We will cut this segment out and send it to her so that she knows that.
Okay.
Considering the difficulty in the funding area of today, and of course the threats of the Republican administration, what advice would you give to a young person starting out today?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question, and every time, as a chair, I get a lot of people that come to me and ask me to help, and I discuss funding with my faculty, even some very senior faculty that have been struggling with getting funded as the NIH budget has been curtailed over the last several years, and this has started quite some time ago, and the threat, as you mentioned, is very great right now. We just had a march on science here, a march for science here, around the country, and I think people have to understand. It's very important that people, the lay public especially, just understand how science is done. That science is not about turning on funding today and having a result tomorrow. Science is about sustained funding, a continuation of the process that science is done. And the economic payoff for that process will be enormous in terms of well-being for the population, curing diseases, and just understanding nature. And I think that I just tell the faculty and I tell the students to persevere, to don't give up, to continue to modify your grants, to continue to ask new questions, to continue to find good collaborators to help. Now, unfortunately, some people cannot sustain that, and after many years, they just decide they don't want to deal with it anymore. It's stressful. Right. This is not an easy job, and it's very stressful. And your promotion and your salary and your reputation is built on your ability to get funded, and without a substantial budget to the NIH, the NSF, and other funding agencies, I think it's going to become even more difficult. And I certainly would not discourage young people from going into a career in science. But I would get them to think very carefully about the kinds of questions they ask, how they write grants, and the mentors they choose. Because I think that will either make or break a career. Now, there are many other ways one can use a degree in science, and we try to present to students all the opportunities that are available to them. And many of them have made outstanding careers other than doing bench science. And I never expected that every student and every postdoc that has gone through the lab would follow in my footsteps. Many of them have done other things very successfully, and they seem to be very happy. But they start out wanting to do bench science, wanting to make discoveries, wanting to do new things, and I try to be as optimistic as possible and as realistic as possible, but it is getting harder.
Irv, I think I will wrap up by saying thank you. I've known you for a long time, both professionally and socially. It is nice to learn a little bit more about your career, and I'm hopeful that our listeners will enjoy hearing about your career. But on behalf of the society and on behalf of myself, I wanted to thank you for giving us this opportunity to learn about your career and your willingness to share it with others. Thank you very much.
You're quite well. It's been my pleasure.